Welcome to Chopper's Politics. I'm Christopher Hope, the Telegraph's Associate Editor, Chopper to my pals, and today we're bringing you a bonus episode to react to Chancellor Rishi Sunak's Spring Statement. Among other things, the Chancellor announced a 5p cut to fuel duty and unveiled an increase in the National Insurance contribution threshold to help households coping with the cost of living crisis.
From this July, people will be able to earn £12,570 a year without paying a single penny of income tax or national insurance. That is a £6 billion personal tax cut for 30 million people across the United Kingdom. A tax cut for employees worth over £330 a year.
So now that we've let Sunak's statement sink in, for a few hours at least, let's have a considered look at how today's announcements will affect our wallets. Joining me to crunch numbers are Associate Editor Gordon Rayner and columnist Juliet Samuel. And before we start, I should say that Juliet has soldiered on despite fighting off the last vestiges of a COVID virus bout. Gordon Rayner, Juliet Samuel, welcome to Chopper's Politics. A quick one today. We're going to interpret and read and find out what on earth this spring statement means, with your 5 takeaways, your 5 things you need to know. Gordon Rayner, the first one.
Well, just to summarise the top lines, I guess we should do first, Chris. So motorists, 5p off a litre of petrol, starting now, up until March next year, when it may or may not then go up. Homeowners have been given a 0% VAT giveaway on any kind of improvements that increase the efficiency of their homes, like solar panels, insulation, heat pumps. There is £500 million extra for the Household Support Fund from April, which is meant to help the poorest families. And then the big rabbit that he pulled out of the hat was a 1p cut in income tax in the basic rate from 20p to 19p, which he says he will do before the next election, which he said will be in 2024. So he was kind of making 2 announcements in one there.
That's right. And I've got his tax plan he published in my hand, and in it he says it will happen in April 2024, so the next election is after then.
So May 2024, stick it in your
good
diary.
Rain, look at you know what you're doing there. May 24 could be the next election.
Yeah. And then we should also mention national insurance. He did not cancel the national insurance increase, which I think we knew he wasn't going to do, but he did raise the threshold at which national insurance becomes payable from £9,500 to £12,500. So basically bringing national insurance in line with income tax, which means that if you earn £12,570, you won't pay any income tax or national insurance at all.
Okay, Juliet Samuel, what do you think about that then?
Well, it sounds great on the face of it, but when you actually look into the numbers, what you find is that last year the Chancellor announced tax rises that are going to raise about £30 billion a year. And what he's just done today is to reverse about a third of those. So he's done tax cuts worth £10 billion a year, but the net result is that taxes are still going to be massively up, in the course of this Parliament than where they were going to be before.
Yes, that's right, and Juliet's right there, Gordon, isn't she? Because if you look at just the issue of personal income tax and national insurance, then you can see there that the increase in thresholds is going to be worth a £5 billion cut for workers.
Yeah.
The income tax cut in April 2024 is worth a £6 billion giveaway.
Yeah.
That's £11 billion.
Yeah. But
the increase in 1.25% of NICs is £12 billion. So we are, as a group of people in this country, £1 billion worse off, notwithstanding with the other taxes there, which Juliet talked about.
Yeah.
There's also a big line in the spreadsheet that he didn't even mention, which is to do with students. And actually, a lot of the extra money that's going to be collected by the Exchequer is going to come from students due to basically reforms to repayment of student loans. But what this effectively means is that, yes, you're getting this income tax cut, at the very end of the Parliament, just before the general election. But in the meantime, the tax burden on young people, on working people, is going up and up and up to fund essentially people who have property and who earn income at the higher end.
Yeah, I mean, I think people will look at this and they'll find it quite confusing, frankly, because they'll think, well, hang on a minute, I'm paying 1.25% more national insurance, but I'm going to be paying a penny less income tax. What's the point of that? It feels like, taking money out of one pocket and putting it into the other. Paul Johnson of the IFS says that there will be a net benefit to anyone earning under £35,000. So the Chancellor will be pleased that such a respected figure as Paul Johnson has said that. Equally, Paul Johnson says that 70% of workers will see their taxes cut by more than they'll pay through the new national insurance levy. So I think there is a net benefit to people, but it's very confusing to people as to exactly why he's done it the way he's done it. And I think that is very much a political point.
Juliet Torsten-Bell from the Resolution Foundation, possibly the other economist apart from Paul Johnson, who everyone listens to around this time of the year, he said, what do you do if you want to be a future Conservative leader? You cut income tax. And isn't that what Gordon Rayner is saying there? He's saying, why on earth are you increasing NICs and cutting income tax if it's not for basically a political message to the backbenchers?
Yeah, well, this also raises the question of why we even have this crazy tax system in the first place, right? The reason we have the national insurance system, the reason we have this, new health and social care levy is essentially political. It's a smokescreen whereby you can increase taxes on the one hand, but still say that you're putting down the big tax, income tax, and everyone says hooray. But the tax burden, all it does is shuffle it about a bit, and in fact, what it ends up doing is putting more of the tax burden on the working population and less of it on the inactive population and pensioners. So yeah, it's a sort of political added complication to the system that doesn't make it fairer or reduce the tax burden.
Okay, so that's the personal taxation dealt with there, Juliet. What about the cost of living crisis, which so many of us are worrying about at the moment?
Well, there was almost nothing in the budget on that, the Spring Statement. Essentially, he gave a little more help to the lowest income households on energy bills, but it was really a negligible amount. And in fact, if you look at the OBR forecasts for what's going to happen to real household incomes, it's actually quite a shocking chart. You see the biggest fall in disposable income basically since the chart, the start of the chart, which goes back to the 1950s. Household incomes are forecast to go down 2% in 1 year, this year. And there was nothing at all in the budget to alleviate that or to address that, or even anything about, what monetary policy should do on inflation and the cost of living. Yeah,
Gordon, it's kind of hold tight for a big roller coaster, right?
Yeah, I think, unsurprisingly, we heard Labour hammering him on the fact that he decided against a windfall tax on oil and gas. Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor, was making the point that if he had imposed a windfall tax on oil and gas, that their profits have gone up so much that would have raised £3 billion, which would have been quite a handy amount. She made the point that BP's described the current energy crisis as a cash machine for them. So it's a point which will go down well with a lot of voters. I think this idea that maybe the oil and gas companies could have taken a hit to help people out.
Well.
Yeah, there's a guy called Kevin Hollinrake, a Tory MP on the Treasury Committee, making that very point. I think some MPs in the red wall, the Tory MPs up there, Gordon, may think, I think it's basically a free hit at the moment on big oil companies, and it might be worth quite good electorally.
Yeah, I mean, I think politically it would be difficult to see how who would object to that other than the oil companies.
Pension funds might. A lot of our pensions.
Yeah. There are political reasons for not doing it, but when in fairness to Rachel Reeves, a lot of Sunak's statement today was very much about presentation and politics, and so she has presentationally come up with an idea which will get on well with people.
And there's no help here, Gordon Rayner, for people with large oil tanks at their houses.
No, thank you, Chris. That's me, as you know. Yeah, I think people who rely on fuel oil for their heating, people who live in rural areas and have a tank of oil rather than gas or electricity, they've seen perhaps the biggest increase in their fuel costs, and a lot of those are pensioners. I was paying something like 37p a litre for heating oil not too long ago. I had a delivery the other day, and it was 130 pence a litre. So that's the sort of increases you're talking about.
Yeah, Juliet. No, but of course that's a small portion of the country with heating oil, Juliet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, to be fair on the windfall tax point, it is a bit perverse that if you want your companies to produce more oil and gas, then probably now is not the time to whack up taxes on them. On the other hand, maybe you could have designed a clever tax that would have incentivized, new production, but tax legacy profits or something like that. But yeah, essentially, there's not going to be help for the vast majority of the country. There's going to be a cost of living squeeze that the Chancellor appears to have decided there's not much he can do about it, or there's not much that he's willing to do about it, and so. It seems to be fingers crossed, hope that it's temporary and we come out the other side in one piece.
Julia, I was struck by a warning in the back of the blue book, as we must call it, not a red book this time, that this cut in income tax is subject to events happening. It says there that there's enough fiscal headroom, as everything must be, of course. And alarmingly, didn't he? Rishi Sunak said in the chamber that the OBR has not accounted for the war in Ukraine. Yeah. We should be prepared for the economy and public finances to worsen potentially significantly.
Yeah.
What do you make of that? Is it odd that there was no real... I mean, you talked about security, but there's nothing on defence spending, for example. I mean, and the uncertainty is huge, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is quite scary, essentially, because you can see in all the charts this big shock coming through, which is inflation, which is the effect of the war in Ukraine. And then all the forecasts they pop back down again back into line afterwards and assume that everything's going to be okay. But, at the same time, you have politicians talking about, we need to stop buying Russian oil and gas and make a permanent change. And, well, if we're going to do that, how's that going to feed through into all of these costs and all of these indicators? It's not going to be a temporary blip. It's going to be a structural change potentially to the whole economy. And there really was no discussion about how to deal with that. I think the only element to it that maybe you could see him preparing for that was the fact that he didn't, as we've talked about, he's raised taxes more than he's cut them. So perhaps you could argue he's sort of in the background built up a bit of a war chest. The reason he's building up this fiscal space is because things could get a lot worse.
He talked about the OBR saying that fiscal headroom could be wiped out with relatively small changes, and we're seeing some fairly big changes. And that's at a time when, as he pointed out, the government's going to be spending 83 billion on debt interest in the next financial year, which I think he said was 4 times what they paid last year. They're huge sums of money. That's the size of a chunky government department just on debt interest. So, in fairness to Sunak, you can see why he's having to be slightly cautious when it comes to things like increasing defence spending or more giveaways, because there's a lot of uncertainty and he's got a massive amount of debt to service.
Were you worried by the lack of news about defence spending? A lot of us thought there may be some more money for lethal weaponry. He claims, of course, that they have set this 4-year defence spending window back only a few months ago. Is that enough for you, Juliet?
No, it's not enough. I mean, given all the rhetoric we've heard about, we're in a new age now where Europe has to wake up to this threat on its doorstep, and we've lectured European countries about not pulling their weight, which is fair enough because most of them don't. But at the same time, there doesn't really appear to be any structural change to the balance of how we use our resources and what we think we're going to have to spend on security in the near future. So it's a bit of a cop out, essentially. I mean, it's a head in the sand idea that we can kind of go on with this model where we tax and spend on social services essentially without having to put more and more into the costs of defence, where we've essentially been just coasting for a long time.
Gordon?
I think that the point about the defence settlement is a very fair one, but I also think that he is leaving himself open to accusations that he's building up a war chest for election giveaways at a time when he should be perhaps using that money to help Ukraine. And again, it's a very much we're talking about politics here rather than necessarily pounds and pence.
We'll come on to that. I mean, we've got the first three headlines we picked out are personal taxation, cost of living, and the outlook for the economy. The fourth one, I think, is business. He signalled, didn't he, Juliet, there'll be some support for businesses announced in the November budget coming into force in April next year.
Yeah, he talked about the three big issues with business, how businesses spend their money and how they're taxed, to do with them training people, them spending enough on research, and the fact that they don't invest enough, and that essentially he's going to review all of these areas and look at why it is the tax system doesn't incentivize businesses doing what we want them to do, which is to become high tech, skill up their workforces and offer higher paying jobs. That said, there was no word at all about corporation tax, which is essentially a tax on investment, and which is due to go up massively from 19% to 25%. That was something that was done as a result of the pandemic. There was no indication that that's going to be reversed. So, The other thing I should say is on business rates. There was some relief for smaller businesses on business rates, but again, no real overhaul of the system, which most small businesses would say is hugely unfair and regressive.
On the last edition of this podcast, Gordon, we spoke to Tony Danker, the CBI's Director General, and he was saying what he wanted in the Spring Statement was evidence that they're putting growth at the heart of what has to happen. He says that without growth, you either have to increase spending or cut taxes to meet the ever-increasing government budget.
Yep, and how many times do we hear chancellors say that they're going to fund their budgets through growth? Answer every single time. So it is important, but it's almost alchemy, isn't it? They talk about growth. There are things that chancellors can do to try and promote growth, as you say, cut taxes on businesses. But at the moment, I suspect that Sunak feels he doesn't quite have the headroom to be able to do that, as well as cutting personal taxes. So that's maybe why he's done the personal taxes now and the business taxes later on.
There was one mention of the word Brexit, wasn't there, Juliet, on the issue of VAT at the beginning, but that was about it. Now, the idea that the CBI talked about was using the Brexit freedoms, the Brexit opportunities to try and help companies outperform those on the continent. Have you seen any evidence of this being grasped yet by the government or by the Chancellor himself?
No, I mean, we've seen tweaks here and there, but essentially this goes to the broader point that Gordon was making about growth, which is that, we've come out of the EU. We've negotiated for all of those freedoms that the Prime Minister wanted, at the cost of essentially leaving Northern Ireland half in the EU. And we still don't know what the government wants to do with all this freedom, why they negotiated for it and what they're going to change about the economy. What are they going to deregulate? How are they going to make life easier for businesses and, change the model of the UK so that it's a higher growth, more science intensive one, or one that just works better. And there's really still no answer on that, and they're running out of excuses. The pandemic isn't really taking up centre stage anymore.
It's odd, isn't it, Gordon Rayner, because there's a big risk, isn't there, if you believe in Brexit, that say Keir Starmer wins the election in 2 years' time, here's a guy who isn't entirely comfortable with Brexit, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
In some eyes, he could try and reverse elements of it. I'm surprised that the government isn't charging forward and cementing Brexit and shutting the door firmly on that debate of going back into or even near the European Union's influence.
Well, yeah, and as Juliet said, there was a brief mention of Brexit. Rishi Sunak said there was going to be a Brexit benefit for homeowners in this cut in VAT from 5% to 0% on home improvements that improve energy efficiency, like solar, insulation and heat pumps. I think we should also mention, by the way, that as he himself pointed out, that equates to £1,000 saving for a solar panel array, which means that it's going to come down from £20,000 to £19,000. I'm not sure that was what people were thinking of when they voted for Brexit. I agree. I think there are opportunities for some big ideas and big changes, and we're seeing very, very small beer.
It's frustrating, isn't it? And is it a problem in Whitehall, do you think, Juliet, or is it the politicians don't believe in it after all the talking?
I think that, for one thing, there has been distraction from the pandemic, but I think broadly the problem is that every time you embrace major change, there are winners and losers. There's a whole load of vested interests who win from the current system, especially on the regulatory side, who are going to fight every change tooth and nail. And, the winners from it are potentially speculative, and, they don't exist yet. So there's a natural inertia to any kind of major reforms, especially remodeling your entire economy. And I think that the government has allowed itself simply to be bogged down in that and to end up just tweaking things rather than, being prepared to fight any major battle.
Okay, finally, the fifth area, the fifth takeaway from all this, Gordon Rayner, has to be the politics of it. The budgets are always political.
Yeah, and I think this one, more than many, because of where we are in the electoral cycle. As we've discussed, he's looking at a 2024 election. We know from what he told us today that he has got a fair amount of headroom, that he says he's being cautious about that because of the danger that headroom could be wiped out. But the fact that he's already announced a 1% cut in income tax 2 years out from a general election does make you ask the question, well, what is he planning next? Because if you don't normally go for that sort of big announcement this far out from a general election. So what else will he do? You presume he's got some big ideas. Clearly, he's thinking about positioning himself to take over from Boris Johnson at some point. And I think the point that we have to take into account when we were talking earlier about the sort of slightly confusing picture of more NICs but lower income taxes, that they are trying to manoeuvre Labour into a position where Labour don't really have anywhere to go. With national insurance, they've put it up to this very high figure now, where it's going to be very hard for Labour to say we're going to spend more on the NHS by increasing your national insurance even more. They'd be very brave to do that. And equally, Labour would be very brave to say we're going to reverse an income tax cut, because that's going to be very popular with people. So there is some clever politics at play here. There's some risky politics too, but this is why they're doing it. It's so that Keir Starmer's going to struggle to say that these are bad ideas, and he's going to change them.
Juliet, where do you see the politics of this? Is Gordon right that they're trying to manoeuvre the Labour Party into a place where they can take them on? I mean, the big problem remains now that the Tories can't be trusted on tax, can they? They've increased national insurance when they said they wouldn't on page 2 of the 2019 manifesto.
Yeah, I think they are trying to get a bit out of this problem they created last year, which was that they stopped being the low tax party and suddenly Labour became the party arguing for tax cuts, and they're trying to reverse that a bit and do tax cuts that then Labour will find itself arguing against. But I also think that there's some manoeuvring sort of by Sunak with regard to the Tory party itself, some internal party management, whereby after last year a lot of MPs and members were grumbling, well, this guy's gone native in the Treasury, whatever happened to Tory government? And so he's trying to give them some goodies or a kind of indication that it's not just rhetoric, that he's not just in his heart a tax cutter, but he really is prepared to do it. And he's trying to do that before his reputation as a Treasury suit sets in too much.
I was struck by that interview in the Mail on Sunday at the weekend, when on the wall there's a picture of Nigel Lawson, of course, who cut income tax over 5 years, 83 to 87, didn't he, by about 5 percentage points from memory. So he maybe wants these channeling his inner Lawson, possibly.
Yeah, he'd like to think so.
Robert Jenrick, the former cabinet minister, said that the Lawson portrait will be looking down admiringly on him. So that will have been music to Rishi Sunak's ears, I'm sure.
We can ask Lawson himself. He is around. We can ask him what he thinks of all this.
Yeah.
But there is politics here, isn't there? I mean, it is. He is manoeuvring here. He's cutting income tax on the eve of the next general election. As Gordon says, there'll be more to come from that. He's trying to create the necessary headroom for more cuts. And he is the man to beat, isn't he? If Boris Johnson does have to fall on his sword over Partygate, and that could still happen when Ukraine is less in the news, and maybe the police come back and Sue Gray, remember her? She does her full report finally. Do you think he strengthened his position now with the backbenchers, Rishi Sunak, Juliet?
Yeah, I think so. Because the main thing that people would say about Rishi Sunak in the period when Boris was most in trouble was, well, I like him, he seems very charming, but what are his politics? Maybe is he really a Tory? Is he really a tax cutter? So that's what he has to address in terms of his support amongst the MPs and amongst the party. And despite everything, despite all the hard reality we can look at and say, well, actually the numbers don't bear out what he's saying. You saw the cheers in the chamber today from the Tories. They just love the prospects of, being able to cheer a tax cut in the chamber, and that will have an effect, despite everything else.
Yeah, he said it was the biggest net cut in personal taxes in over 25 years, didn't he? And that was what got the massive cheer. You could say that it's partly because he's put taxes up so much that he's able to cut them. But
well, they have.
It went down well.
There were some figures on the Telegraph website today that show that John Major and Margaret Thatcher cut taxes by about 3%, and Labour under Blair and Brown, and then Tories under Cameron, May and Boris Johnson all increased in their terms by about 3% over the times that they've been in office. So there's a worry here that we are just going towards a high tax economy and productivity is suffering, isn't it, Juliet?
Yeah, I think that's definitely the case, and I think that one of the forces dragging us there is, of course, that we have an aging population. So, there's more and more of the population relies on health services and relies on pensions. But at the same time, you've also had a government that's decided over the long term it's going to subsidise low wages and, have a kind of benefit system that is essentially paid to most of the workforce, whether you have a job or not, rather than trying to address, any underlying issues that have caused that. So, and once you've spent the money, it's very, very hard to take it away again. So, you end up with this inexorable dragging force that drags your tax base up and up.
Do you think, stepping back, Gordon Rayner, we have an idea of what Sunakism is? I mean, Lawson became this. Lawsonism was about cutting income tax, basically. What do we think Sunakism might be after the last budgets he did? Of course, have been in the white heat of COVID. Yeah, this is the first kind of almost a post-COVID budget.
Yeah.
Gordon?
I don't feel massively nearer to knowing. I think the 1p cut in income tax was the most striking element of this statement. I think that is clearly trying to point the way to where he wants to go. So I think that he wants people to think that Sunakism is tax cutting. But as you said, he's had to respond to these unprecedented trio of crises that's meant that he's not been able to. Well, he's had to be very reactive, hasn't he, rather than proactive. So I think the jury's still out. I think we'll have a much better idea after the next full budget. And as we said earlier, it's going to be fascinating to see if he can do something even more eye-catching than cutting income tax in the next 2 years. And
Juliet, just finally to you, what do you think Sunakism, if anything?
I really don't think we know right now. I think the tendency is to think that Sunak is a Davos man. He's got the suit, he's got the hoodie, he's got the Instagram account of and I don't think we've seen anything to disprove that so far. So we'll see.
Gordon Rayner, our associate editor, and Juliet Samuel, one of our commentators, thank you for joining us this week on Choppers Politics. Great to have you both on. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks very much.
Well, that's all for this Spring Statement special edition of Chopper's Politics. Please let me know your thoughts on what Rishi Sunak had to say. Email me, chopperspolitics@telegraph.co.uk, or tweet me @chopperspodcast. And if you want to hear more from Gordon or from Juliet and their expert analysis, why not become a Telegraph subscriber? Go to telegraph.co.uk/chopper to get your first month completely free of charge. Please don't say we don't treat you, particularly in a cost of living crisis. Thank you to my guests this week, the Telegraph's own Gordon Rayner and Juliet Samuel. Thank you to my producers, Louisa Wells, Giles Gear, and Theodora Louloudis. But most importantly of all, thank you to you for listening. And for more about what's happening in the world of politics, please sign up to my Chopper's Politics newsletter, delivered every weekday into your email inbox. The link to sign up to that will be in the show notes to this episode. And of course, if you can, please do buy a copy of the Daily Telegraph. I know you won't regret it. Until next time though, cheerio!